I love RTS games. When I was just 8 years old, my mom made me learn how to type before I was allowed to play StarCraft Brood War online. I spent hundreds of hours in custom games as a kid, playing Cat and Mouse, Dragon Ball Z, and Poker Defense. It wasn't just StarCraft either. I loved the campaigns of Age of Empires and Age of Mythology. RTS games pushed video game graphics to the absolute limits of the time. These were beautiful looking 2D games that had so many cool effects to mimic a 3D-like environment. In the mid-2000s, these games were the epitome of esports. Competitive StarCraft had taken over South Korea, creating celebrities and even being on national television. So what happened? How are we at a point in 2025 where these new games are having player counts of under 100 active players or being shut down altogether before they even release? Well, first, we need to talk about Stormgate. Stormgate is an RTS created by Frost Giant Studios, a team made of many ex-StarCraft developers and a studio that looked like a real shining light after a huge pause in RTS games for the last 14 years. While Stormgate initially released to some mixed reviews, overall it was seen as a pretty positive game and something that was decently polished upon release. What Frost Giant Studios didn't realize, and I think what a lot of the community didn't realize either, is how small the RTS genre has become. With a peak player count at release in July 2024, Stormgate topped out at a measly 4,456 concurrent players. A year later, in May 2025, we see peaks of only up to 300 players and an average concurrent well under 100. It's safe to say, unless anything changes, this game will not be up for much longer and the servers will be shut down. However, Stormgate wasn't the only new RTS. A small game called Battle Aces appeared around the same time that was trying to revolutionize the RTS for a new generation. They had a goal of removing the base building and macro production focus that every other RTS game had focused on up till this point. It's a pretty cool concept, having an RTS where you don't have to worry about your base and it's more just focused on the unit battling and micro control. However, the few beta cycles this game had spelled bad news for the future of this game as well. With a maximum concurrent player count of only 637, Battle Aces has officially given up and is canceling production of the game. So where does this leave RTS today? Now that we know new RTS games are failing, let's talk about why. I honestly think the biggest reason is that RTS games are way too difficult. In a 1v1 scenario, you have no one to blame but yourself, and losing in this style of game can be extremely frustrating. Not only do you need to memorize a bunch of build orders and have perfect execution and timing, but each individual game has its own set of circumstances and variables as well. A huge part of real-time strategy is trying to get information on your opponent. If you realize your opponent is trying to rush down your base, you can build extremely defensively and survive the rush, and then the game's over because your economy is better. On the other hand, if your opponent decides not to rush but they kill your scout and you can't see what they're doing, and you decide to play defensively because they technically could be rushing you, then they get an economy lead and the game is usually over at the top end. These tiny little micro cascades are extremely frustrating and lead to many people just not wanting to play these games competitively. A 1v1 game like chess is hard enough, but not being able to see what your opponent is doing in half of your games is a ridiculous standard. This is also why I have the most respect out of any game for a professional RTS player. The amount of training and skill you need for these is absolutely insane. To have to dedicate your life to these games just to reach the top end is ridiculous. I've been Diamond 1 in League of Legends, I've been 4,000 rating in Overwatch. A lot of those types of games, if you know what you're doing, you'll climb extremely quick. RTS is just a completely different type of beast altogether. While Blizzard really seems to not care much about their StarCraft titles anymore, fortunately these games have an extremely large grassroots community. StarCraft Brood War is still absolutely dominated by South Korea. Multiple streamers make a very good living off the game, and there are still 2 very large tournaments held every year. I personally watch a channel that you've seen some clips from in the background of this video called Artosis Cast. He's a really cool guy that's tried to keep the Brood War scene alive outside of South Korea, and most of his casting is just looking at 2 top players play each other on the competitive ladder, and these videos manage to get 20 to 50,000 views pretty consistently. While this shows that there's definitely still demand for this game, it's kind of in a slow bleed out. Tournament frequency has gone down a lot over the past decade, prize pools continue to shrink, and players can really only make a living off streaming, and this is thanks to advertisers becoming harder and harder to secure for these legacy style games. A good example is that guy Artosis and his co-caster Tasteless. They used to be hired by the organization running most of these tournaments as professional casters, but they are now being kept alive through their Patreon communities to be able to still do this. I love that there's still enough passion to make this stuff happen, but it really is looking worse and worse every year that goes by. Okay, that's enough about Brood War. You're probably thinking that game's 30 years old. Who really cares about it anyways? Well, StarCraft 2 has been in a pretty decent spot up until this current year. Although Blizzard stopped supporting the StarCraft 2 competitive scene in 2019, from 2020 to 2024, the ESL League had taken the place of the official StarCraft League. However, this year in 2025, the ESL announced it was shutting down due to lack of advertiser funding. This means that we are likely going to see StarCraft 2 function the same way as StarCraft Brood War for the foreseeable future, where it will be more based on large tournaments instead of a consistent league circuit. Things were looking very bleak for StarCraft 2 until it was announced for the 2025 Esports World Cup. It was one of the last games announced, and the community was extremely worried until it was actually shown. Overall, while StarCraft Brood War and StarCraft 2 still have relatively healthy communities, they are definitely on their last legs of support. I would be shocked if they ever actually grew in popularity. Right now they're just trying to hang on to the current players and viewers that they have. It's been sad to see new games in the genre fail so horribly, but it looks like this genre is just set to disappear as a whole. When you have studios that make pretty decent looking and fun to play projects that no one wants, it's not the fault of the studios. Players can blame the developers all they want, but there simply is no demand left for these kind of games. And don't get me wrong, it's not like RTS as a whole is disappearing, it's just that there aren't going to be any new competitive RTS games. Single player RTS, for example, they are billions, I've put many hours into, and those games are super fun. They're just a completely different type of game that's not based around the actual online multiplayer competitive side. I loved RTS games in the past, but I'll be the first to admit that I just don't enjoy the competitive aspect of them anymore. On that note, I've been talking too long already. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you like content on video game development or video game news, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will talk to you in the next one.